A. Pleasure and necessity. Active reason, in its immediate shape, as a pure, natural, individual self-consciousness, can be likened to a Casanova, since its method of seeing itself in its object is seduction. As Hegel says, after abandoning observation and the shadowy existence of science, laws, and principles, it plunges into life and indulges to the full the pure individuality in which it appears, its body. It does not so much make its own happiness as straightway take it and enjoy it." End quote. The problem here, and the reason why it fails, is this. In its act of seduction, it wants to see just itself as this particular individual, as another, or see another self-consciousness as itself. But in the outcome of this unity of the two independent self-consciousnesses, the opposite happens. In joining its body with another's, the pleasure enjoyed is not one-sided but mutual, hence not individual but universal. And this is the necessity, what necessarily happens in every act of seduction by a Casanova or a Faust. It wanted to see itself in the other as a complete individual, a duplicate of itself. Instead, it does not experience itself in its individuality, but rather as a universal. Hence, its individuality is smashed to pieces. Thus, its experience is a contradiction in which the attained reality of its individuality sees itself destroyed by the negative essence confronting it, which is an object that has no content. End quote. The object, the woman seduced, has no content, one, because she is just a pure pleasure object. Casanova is only interested in her body, not her name, who she is, her accomplishments, family history, etc. Also, too, as the purest form of self-realizing spirit, its pleasure object is only the abstraction of reason, or the abstract category, whose sole content is the empty abstractions, unity, difference, and relation, the exact opposite of the fullness of life that it wanted. It thought it had taken the plunge from dead theory into life, but is really taking the plunge into death, into an empty and alien necessity or dead actuality. The lesson our Casanova has learned is that universality and necessity are essential to individuality, a truth taken up by our next shape of consciousness. As a side note, because of Hegel's reference here to Goethe's Faust, pleasure and necessity can also be interpreted through the lens of Faust's seduction of Gretchen. In brief, Faust, reason as a bare individual, wants to see himself as an individual in Gretchen, the independent other or pleasure object. But necessity forces him to see himself as a universal instead, and in a social context, in which his individuality is negated. Thus, the pursuit of pleasure via seduction fails because it leads to unhappiness. The natural world, where one cares only for himself, inexorably leads to the social world, where one must care about others and society. The natural act or impulse produces social responsibility, for sex leads to pregnancy and a child, which leads to marriage, family, social norms, and relations. Sexual love as mere pleasure leads to the disaster that happens in Goethe's Faust, where individuality gets shipwrecked on the rocks of universality and necessity. B, the law of the heart and the frenzy of self-conceit. Here we are still involved with an immediate, natural individual, but one a little closer to the goal of a spiritual, ethical individual, which happens when individuality is fully merged with universality. This individual, in contrast to the former, has universality and necessity within himself as a law in his heart. As reason, his desire is to have this law become an independent object in which he can see himself, thus becoming all reality, subject and object at once. The problem, in short, is that everyone has the same desire, to have the law of their heart objectified in the world. When the individual finds that the law of his heart is rejected by everyone, he flies into a rage of self-conceit and believes that the way of the world is the problem. All people are just self-seeking individuals, opportunists who care only about themselves and not the universal good. Important is that what we are about to see here is the individual purging himself of his particularity, a major theme of the rest of the book. We see a shift from the object as universal and particular to the object as just universal. A shift from the individual's insisting that he see reflected in the independent object his immediate particular self, as well as the universal of his law, to seeing in the object just his universal or rational self, which is identical in everyone. Okay, the individual's law of his heart is not yet realized, not yet an existing law or public ordinance everyone must follow. Examples of the law of the heart may be: people should not park in handicapped zones. People should clean up after their dogs. The wealthy should pay their fair share of taxes, etc. This individual also regards the present order of laws and ordinances as dead, oppressive, and hostile to the inner law of his and all hearts. Further, and in contrast to the former shape, this individual seeks not only his own pleasure and happiness, but that of everyone. His heart throbs for the welfare of humanity. So, the individual as reason then realizes the law, the universal of his heart, now become a universal public ordinance. His pleasure is now a reality, but is it really? There are two problems. First, he no longer recognizes himself, the law of his heart, in the universal ordinance it has become. It is now as alien and hostile to him as the original order of laws. Indeed, He wanted to see universality or law in the form only of his immediate particular individuality or being for self, not in the form of a free and objective universality. What he doesn't yet realize is that his act is an act of liberation. As Hegel says, it is an act which frees himself from himself, quote, by putting himself in the universal element of existent reality, end quote. He thereby purges himself of his particularity and elevates himself into the true universality of reason. Indeed, the real world now becomes his own essential being, which is a unification of individuality and universality, which he yet cannot see. The second problem is that the other people in society now turn against him and his law, because it is the law of his heart and not theirs. They, also being reason, want to see themselves reflected, embodied in the objective universal laws that govern them. And this is perhaps why, when they reject his law, they turn to the existing laws, embracing them as their own laws, which they now regard as reflecting themselves. It is at this point that this individual becomes deranged and perverted, and we are forced to transition to a virtue-seeking consciousness. First, he remains stuck between a universal and individual view of things. He learns that in realizing the law of his own heart, all laws and ordinances are really animated by the consciousness of all and are the laws of all hearts. He learns that, quote, individuality becomes an object to itself in the form of universality, end quote. But he still doesn't see this. He doesn't see himself in the law he himself has made objective. So he is in a contradictory or deranged state, which he links to the perversions of fanatical priests and gluttonous despots. In effect, his law both is and is not himself. It is my law and it is not my law. Quote, his essence, his objectified law, is non-essential, does not reflect himself, and his reality is an unreality, end quote. What this form of modern individualism finally concludes is that the universal order is perverted, and it is individuality and self-interest that is the source of this perversion. The result is a struggle of all against all, a, quote, universal state of war in which each wrests what he can for himself, executes justice on the individuality of others, and establishes his own, which is equally nullified through the action of others, end quote. Hegel calls this situation the way of the world, which the next shape of consciousness will be determined to transform into the true and good universal by getting rid of individuality itself. C. Virtue and the way of the world. In short, active reason, in the shape of virtue, believes that virtue, the good, the universal, does not yet exist in the way of the world. Only vice does. Virtue exists only in itself or implicitly, but not actually. And this is because only individuality and self-interest rule in the world. The truth will emerge at the end that the good, the universal, does indeed exist, and it is precisely through individuality and its actions that this universal gets actualized. So, this knight of virtue, setting out on his mission, has a very lofty and noble aim: to make the whole world virtuous. His end and his purpose, not yet realized, is the universal and the good, the universal good, not the individual self-centered good. As a form of reason, this modern individual wants to see its end realized in the world, the object standing over against it, so it can experience itself as all reality. The problem is that the world, the way of the world, consists of individuals who only pursue their self-interest or the individual good and not the common universal good. So individuality is the problem and must be sacrificed and eradicated, both in the Knight of Virtue himself and in the way of the world. Quote, individuality is to be brought under the discipline of the universal. And Hegel even underscores that true discipline requires nothing less than the sacrifice of the entire personality as proof that individual peculiarities are no longer insisted on. End quote. So, a battle then ensues between them, the knight bent on transforming the essence of the enemy. But, as Hegel says, this battle is really a sham fight, and this for 3 reasons. First, they both have the same weapons to fight with, namely gifts, capacities, and powers, which are universal in that everyone has them, and hence also good. Further, it is the action of individuality which gives them life and reality, and therefore the defeat of the enemy and his weapons would be the same as destroying the universal and the good. Second, the knight can only enter into battle and engage the enemy through his own actions and using its individuality, which is supposed to be eradicated and not used. Third, the fight is only a sham fight, which it cannot engage in because it also believes not only that the universal good already exists implicitly in the way of the world, but that the good will rise to the surface completely on its own, without virtue's help. Thus, there is no need to fight the enemy. Virtue is essentially impotent and cannot do anything at all. It is in fact just pompous talk, fine phrases, and a rhetoric which doesn't accomplish anything. It just gives the speaker a sense of his own importance. The result is that virtue and the way of the world both vanish. A virtue that believes in a good that only exists in itself and not really disappears because it has learned that the good already exists in the world, and that individuality itself and individual actions are the only means whereby the universal and the good can become actualized. And though the way of the world wins the fight and triumphs over virtue, it too disappears, insofar as it insists that all individuals, everyone, acts out of self-interest. For it is, quote, better than it thinks, as Hegel says, simply because in pursuing its individual good and self-interest, it is also advancing and realizing the universal common good. To help yourself is also to help others. Hence, not only are the universal good and the individual good one and the same, but individuality and universality are now one. And this will take us into ethical life and spirit. We now move to a form of reason which no longer has to actualize itself by changing the world in front of it, by putting an unrealized end into it. It is its own end. Individuality, action, and reality are one. In Hegel's words, quote, reason, being now absolutely certain of its reality, no longer seeks only to realize itself as an end in opposition to the reality which immediately confronts it by overcoming the same. Reason rather has the category as such as the object of its consciousness, end quote. Namely, the unity of itself and being. That is, as the certainty of itself as all reality, self-consciousness is both itself and its object or other, whatsoever this may be.